and learners of the course MEV 002 Environmental and Occupational Hazards. I introduce myself as Dr. Sushmita Bhaskar, working in the discipline of Environmental Studies at the School of Interdisciplinary and Transdisciplinary Studies, Indira Gandhi National Open University, New Delhi. Today we will discuss on the topic disaster management. After listening and reading this module, you will be able to explain the disaster management and disaster risk reduction DRR and describe the National Disaster Management Plan. We have already discussed in the previous sessions regarding the disaster management, that is the different types of the disasters. For example, if it is geological, it is climatological, it is meteorological, that is everything pertaining to the natural hazards. We have also discussed some examples and some case studies from the anthropogenic and human induced disasters, and that includes some important case studies, that of the Bhopal gas tragedy, then the Chernobyl disaster, the nuclear disasters and so on. So now let us see how we can manage the disaster and do we have the Disaster Management Act in place in our country and so on. So India, due to its physiographic and climatic conditions, it is one of the most disaster prone areas of the world. Vulnerability to disasters, for example, emergencies of the CBRN, that is chemical, biological, radiological and nuclear. The origins of all these disasters exist. And there are heightened vulnerabilities to disaster risk, and this can be related to the increasing population, because we are reaching a very high population in the whole world, and there is increased urbanization. There is industrialization, the development within high risk zones. For example, in the coastal areas, there is being high development in those areas. Then environmental degradation. So we are deforesting many of the forested lands, and then we are occupying that and using it for our own purposes. And then climate change. So all these are making the country more vulnerable to natural hazards as well as disasters. Now, the Disaster Management Act of 2005 and the Disaster Management Policy of 2009, they consider disasters to be natural or human induced for defining the roles and the responsibilities. The human induced category, so this includes the CBRN, that is, it could be chemical, biological, radiological and nuclear disasters. All these can occur in industries. For example, there can be accidents. There could be nuclear accidents or explosions. In the same way, chemical accidents can occur, and then there can be fire and explosion. So here again we need the disaster policies and the acts to be in place and the force to come and also help us in time of need. So besides the natural factors that have been discussed, the various human induced activities are also responsible for accelerated impact and increase in frequency of disasters in the country. So the disaster management cycle for all the types of the hazards are faced in India are covered under the Act, both natural as well as the human induced disasters. Reducing risk and enhancing resilience. The role of the central agencies is to support the disaster affected state or the UT in response to request for assistance. So normally the state governments, they put in a request to the central government, and then these central agencies will play a proactive role in the disaster situation. They will deploy their forces, for example the CPRF and so on. Then you have the team from the NDRF, the National Disaster Force team and so on. So in the domains of the disaster management planning, preparedness and capacity building, the central agencies will constantly work to upgrade the Indian disaster management systems and practices as per the global trends. Now, the planning framework has arranged the actions envisaged for disaster reduction under 5 thematic areas for action, with one of the 4 priorities for action of the Sendine framework as its dominant feature. For each hazard, the approach used in this national plan incorporates the 4 priorities which are written down in the Sendine framework into the planning framework for disaster risk reduction under the 5 thematic areas for action. So what are those 5 areas? That is, the first one includes understanding the risk, then inter-agency coordination, investing in DRR structural measures, investing in DRR non-structural measures and the capacity development. The capacity development initiative. So how do we define capacity development overall? So this covers the strengthening of the institutions, mechanisms and capacities of all stakeholders at all levels. The plan recognizes the need for a strategic approach to capacity development and the need for enthusiastic participation of various stakeholders to make it effective. The plan addresses the challenge of putting in place appropriate institutional framework, management systems and allocation of resources for efficient prevention and the handling of the disasters. Now, the planning needs of capacity development are described for all the 4 aspects of disaster management, namely prevention or mitigation to reduce risk from hazards, preparedness for response, effective response when disaster occurs, ability to recover and build back better. Now, the Disaster Management Act 2005, how does it define the disaster? So, by this act, disaster means a catastrophe, mishap, calamity or grave occurrence in any area arising from natural or man-made causes or by accident or negligence which results in substantial loss of life or human suffering or damage to and destruction of property or damage to or degradation of the environment and is of such a nature or magnitude as to be beyond the coping capacity of the community of the affected area. So, a natural hazard can become a disaster when the coping capacity of the entire community will be exceeded. Now, the disaster management, the UNISDR defines disaster risk management as the systematic process of using administrative decisions, organization, operational skills and capacities to implement policies, strategies and coping the capabilities of the society and communities to lessen the impacts of natural hazards and related environmental as well as technological disasters. Now, this comprises of all forms of activities which can include the structural and non-structural measures to prevent or to avoid and to limit, that is to be prepared and to mitigate the adverse effects of these hazards. The term disaster management in the Disaster Management Act of 2005 document, it is comprehensive and it covers all the aspects. It covers disaster risk reduction, disaster risk management, disaster preparedness, disaster response and also the post-disaster recovery. It refers to a continuous and integrated process of planning, organizing, coordinating and implementing measures which are necessary or expedient for the following things, that is prevention of danger or threat of any disaster, mitigation or reduction of disaster of any kind or its severity and its consequences, capacity building and preparedness to deal with any disaster. Now, again prompt response to any threatening disaster situation or disaster. So, these are also being addressed. Assessing the severity or magnitude of the effects of any disaster, evacuation, rescue and relief and rehabilitation and reconstruction. These also play a very important role in disaster management. Now, disaster risk reduction, which involves mitigation of the disaster. As per the UNISDR, this consists of a framework of elements that will help to minimize the vulnerabilities and disaster risk throughout a society to avoid or to limit the adverse impacts of hazards within the broad context of sustainable development. So, the sustainable development goals also have to be kept in mind. Now, we have already discussed the type of disasters, but still giving you an overview. Primarily, the disasters are triggered by natural hazards or by human induced, or it can also arise as a combination of both. In particular, the human induced factors can greatly aggravate the adverse impacts of a natural hazard. And at larger scale globally, the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on the Climate Change has shown that the human induced climate change has significantly increased both the frequency and intensity of extreme weather events. Now, for example, the heavy rains, cyclones or earthquakes, they are all natural and the impacts are usually worsened by many factors related to the human activity. Now, the extensive industrialization and urbanization, this also increases the probability of human induced disasters and the extent of potential damage to life and property from both the natural as well as the human induced disasters. We are again more vulnerable to the chemical, biological, radiological and the nuclear disasters. Natural hazards. So, the widely accepted classification system that is used by the Disaster Information Management System of DES Inventar, this classifies disasters from the natural hazards into 5 main categories. They include geophysical, hydrological, meteorological, climatological and biological hazards. Now, the chemical industrial disasters. Chemical disasters, mostly they are industrial disasters. So, with rapid economic development, there has been a spread of chemical industries. If you see, there are cottage industries, there can be small, medium and also large industries, all sprawled across the country. However, relatively there is a higher presence especially along the west coast due to the proximity of large raw materials, and also the seaports are there for easy export and import of the material. Now, Gujarat, if we take as an example, this alone is estimated to contribute almost half, that is 53% to the total production in the country, which is again followed by Maharashtra, which contributes 9%. The other major producing states include the Uttar Pradesh, Tamil Nadu, Madhya Pradesh and Punjab. So, all these are industrially very rich places or states. Now, on the other hand, if we take the heavy chemical segment, especially the inorganic chemicals, the fuel availability is a determining factor, and hence there is a concentration of these companies around the power plants. Due to regional concentration of the chemical companies in certain places, the chemical hazard has also increased manifold. The growth of chemical industries has also led to increased risk of occurrence of the incidents associated with the hazardous chemicals. So, these events occur due to mishaps or failures in the industry, and they affect the industrial functions, property and productivity. While the common causes for the chemical accidents are deficiencies in safety management systems or human errors, or the natural calamities or sabotage may also trigger such accident. So, chemical and industrial accidents are significant, and they have a long term impact on the community as well as the environment. Now, the chemical accidents can lead to injuries, to pain, to suffering, to loss of lives, damage to property and also to the environment. Hence, a robust plan and mitigation measure needs to be adapted in order to overcome these hazards. Now, let us come on to the nuclear and radiological emergency. So, here again the nuclear disaster is caused due to extraordinary release of radioactive material or radiation, either in the operation of the nuclear reactors or in other nuclear events. Like for example, an explosion can occur due to radiological dispersal device, or certain other nuclear devices, or even the explosion and detonation of the nuclear weapons. So, this how does this occur? It is accompanied with a sudden release of harmful radiations with radioactive materials which can be ejected, or both together, and all this can harm the environment. So, the nuclear and radiations that are emitted, and there is also a diameter, like in the immediate surrounding, so much of radiations that can be very toxic, but again even at a 10 kilometer distance also the radiations are very toxic, and they affect your genetic makeup and the genetic system, and the mutations can occur at the DNA level. So, for a long time you can have certain carcinogenic or other mutagenic problems. Nuclear weapons. So, these are a major accident in the nuclear power plant, or an accidental exposure of radiation due to accident with radioactive material during transportation, faulty practices as that which occurred in the Chernobyl, mechanical failure in radiation facility can lead to nuclear and radiological emergency. So, the entire community, the entire state needs to be evacuated at once if you think that there is a nuclear emergency. So, even though such situation may not arise easily, but everyone has to be prepared to face such emergency. Even if you take the example of Chernobyl, early that morning at previous day, in the morning children were playing in the park and people were happily going to their offices. It was such a beautiful place, but all of a sudden the entire area had to be evacuated, and so many people suffered the burns, and even the animals had to be shot dead, those dogs and everything, because even they can carry certain radiations. So, that was the emergency that they had to face in the year 1986. So, everyone has to be prepared to deal with such radiological and nuclear emergencies. All the organization dealing with nuclear and radiological material, they have an inherent culture of safety. So, they need to see that all the protocols are being followed. They need to follow the best safety practices in the sector and apply the highest standards to ensure minimum risk. However, the nuclear emergencies can still arise due to factors beyond the control of the operating agencies, from human error, system failure, sabotage, extreme natural events like earthquake, flood, the tsunami, or a combination of these. Such failures, even though of very low probability, they may lead to on-site or off-site emergencies. To counter this, Proper emergency preparedness plans must be in place so that there is a minimum loss of life, livelihood, property and impact on the environment. National Disaster Management Plan. So, a nuclear and radiological emergency, in short form we refer to as NRE, it is an incident resulting in or having a potential to result in exposure to and contamination of the workers or the public in excess of the respective permissible limit. These emergencies can be classified into 5 broad categories as given over here. An accident taking place in any of the nuclear facility of the nuclear fuel cycle, including nuclear reactor, or in a facility that is using radioactive sources, that can lead to a large scale release of radioactivity in the environment. A criticality accident in a nuclear fuel cycle facility where uncontrolled nuclear chain reaction takes place inadvertently, leading to burst of the neutrons or gamma radiation that which had happened in Toyokamura in Japan. And it can be an accident during the transportation of the radioactive material. The malevolent use of the radioactive material by terrorists. A large scale nuclear disaster resulting from nuclear weapon attack that can also lead to mass casualty and destruction of large areas and also properties. Unlike a nuclear emergency, the impact of a nuclear disaster is beyond the coping capacity of local authorities, and this can also call for handling at the national level. In this context, it may be mentioned that the International Atomic Energy Agency, this classifies the above emergency scenario in 2 broad categories, that is, one is nuclear and the other is radiological. A nuclear emergency refers to an emergency in which it is presumed that there is a hazard due to the release of energy along with radiation from a nuclear chain reaction or from the decay of the products of chain reaction. This covers accidents in nuclear reactors, criticality situations in fuel cycle facilities, nuclear explosions and so on. All other emergency situations which have the potential hazard of radiation exposure due to decay of radioisotopes, these are classified as the radiological emergencies. Some examples of such emergencies include the accidents that occurred at Goiânia in Brazil, San Salvador, Istanbul in Turkey and also in Panama. So, the overall objective is to prevent this nuclear radiological emergencies, and there is a need to adequately prepare for such emergencies, and such emergencies need to be managed through well planned and established mechanisms, structural, non-structural, so that in such a manner that it will minimize the risk to human health, life and also the environment. Now, 8 nuclear and radiological emergency scenarios are envisaged in the disaster planning. They are listed below. The accidents in nuclear power plants and other facilities in the nuclear fuel cycle, criticality accidents, accidents during transportation of the radioactive material and accidents at facilities using the radioactive sources. Disintegration of satellites during re-entry, nuclear and radiological terrorism and sabotage at the nuclear facilities, state-sponsored nuclear terrorism, explosion of nuclear weapons. And the National Disaster Management Authority in India is mandated to deal with all types of disasters, natural or human induced. The General Superintendent's direction and control of the National Disaster Response Force, that is the NDRF, are vested in and will be exercised by the NDMA. National Crisis Management Committee. This deals with the major crises that have serious or national ramifications. These include incidents such as those requiring close involvement of the security forces or intelligence agencies like the terrorism, counter-insurgency, law and order situations, serial bomb blast, hijacking, air accidents, the CBRN, weapon systems, mine disasters, port and harbour disasters and emergencies, forest fires, oil field fires and also the oil spills. So, the immediate response in the event of a disaster, this lies with the local authorities with the support of the state government. The union government supplements their efforts through providing logistic and financial support, and they deploy the NDRF, the armed forces and other specialized agencies in the case of a chemical, biological, radiological and the nuclear disasters. It will depute experts to assist the state government in its planning and its implementation during severe and the natural as well as the human induced disasters as requested by the state government. We also need to know the levels of the disaster so that the authorities can deal with the situation. The disaster management and the planning is done at various tiers, so it needs to know the account, it needs to take into account the vulnerability of the disaster affected area and also the levels of the disasters. So, the High Power Committee on the Disaster Management in its report 2001, they categorize the disaster situation into 3 levels, that is level 1, level 2 and level 3, and level 0 is that which is normal, that is a period of normalcy, and that should be utilized for the disaster risk reduction. Level 1, this is a level of disaster that can be managed within the capabilities and resources at the district level, but the state authorities will remain in readiness to provide the assistance if required. Level 2, this signifies that the disaster situation requires assistance and active mobilization of resource at the state level and deployment of the state level agencies for disaster management. So, the central agencies must remain vigilant for immediate deployment if required by the state. Level 3, this corresponds to a nearly catastrophic situation or a large scale disaster that overwhelms the state and disaster authorities. So, the categorization of disaster situation is not given in the Act, but we are able to act and prepare ourselves for such situations. Further, the Disaster Management Act does not have any provision for notifying any disaster as a national calamity or a national disaster. Institutional framework at the national level. The overall coordination of the disaster management rests with the Ministry of Home Affairs, and the Cabinet Committee on Security and the National Crisis Management Committee are the key committees that are involved in the top level decision making with regard to disaster management in our country, India. The NDMA is a leading agency responsible for the preparedness and the preparation of the disaster management plans and execution of the disaster management functions at the national level. Now, this is a flow chart. If you see the disaster management institutional mechanism, and you can actually see the various levels and how the people are being deputed and how the management of the same can be taken at the different levels and including the tier systems. So, giving a summary and overview of what we discussed today, we discussed about the disaster management and we gave special focus on the Disaster Management Act 2005 of our country, India. We also explained the various forces, the disaster response forces. Then we also gave you an idea about the management and the decision which is taken at the different level with the help of the coordinated pathways and levels and how they are able to prepare for the different types of disasters. We also discussed about the levels of the disaster, classifying them from level 1 to level 3 and how the disaster management authority can be prepared to deploy the central agencies, that is the people from the NDRF and from the central agencies in order to tackle such emergency situations, if it be a nuclear, a radiological, any natural hazard or a disaster, and we need to be prepared about the same. Thank you for your patient listening.